What's the line? The devil has had the money long enough. Let's see what God can do with it.
There we go. There's our introduction to Christian education.
Right after you hit the record button.
I did already, and I ain't editing. This is Paul, and I've got two friends with me. I've got Brett and Kale, and this is our second three-way conversation. And we've been talking via email what we want to talk about, because I love having these two guys on, because I think there's a chemistry here. And Brett wants to talk about Christian education. Now, I'm a product of Christian education. The Dutch Calvinists, the Christian Reformed Church, is huge into day schools. Everywhere, almost everywhere, a Christian Reformed community of any substance was planted. The first thing they would plant is Christian education. So that's huge with us. And we always had Catholic schools around us. Kale teaches at a Catholic institution, and we've got some other news stories about this, but Brett is working on this stuff, so we're going to let him lead off.
Yeah, well, so Paul just sent an email saying, like, the last time we got together, it was fun, so should we do it again? And what do we want to talk about? And I'm working on a book for Catholic teachers, and I thought, well, Kale works in a Catholic school, and in my ecumenical dialogue work, I've encountered a lot of Reformed Christians who tell me, you should learn more about how the Reformed have thought about Christian education, because they've done sort of maybe more systematic thinking on this than the vast majority of Christian denominations. And so I thought, well, that might be an interesting conversation between the three of us. And then Paul, you sent some wild news stories and some other things. So we thought there's probably enough material here for, a good 90 minutes at least. So
what's our must be done by time here?
5:15, 5:20-ish.
Oh, good, because it's only 1 o'clock here, so I'm ready to go.
Yeah, so
we're in 3 different time zones.
Paul, I'll start going like this when it's like I'm catching the heat. So I'll let you know.
All right.
I'm good.
But basically, like, just 2 hours from now for Kale.
Yeah,
okay.
Max. Yeah.
Max.
All right, let's
all right. So, Brett, what are you writing about?
So I'm writing a book about a concept that I don't know how many people have heard it, but in Catholic education circles, it's and in Canada in particular, I don't know as much about the States, it's caught on, called curriculum permeation. And I was first introduced to it when I was designing a course to teach for Catholic teachers at our local Catholic college. And I went to the school board to consult with them what they'd like to see in a course for Catholic teachers that they would want to hire. And they said curriculum permeation. And I said, oh, okay, what's that? So I learned about it while teaching the course. And the basic idea is something like, look, there's no neutral place from which to teach any subject, like even math. There's certain presuppositions you're going to bring to your teaching of any area at all: math, art, history, science. And so the goal in a Catholic school should be for teachers to be able to teach every single subject from a specifically Catholic point of view. So the criticism of Catholic schools, right, is it's just a public school with a cross on the wall and a religion class. And in Canada, there's people. We have some publicly funded Catholic schools in Saskatchewan, Alberta, and Ontario, and lots of people who want to see them gone say, well, you could just go to your normal public school, and then we could just tack on a religion class, and that would be the same thing. Like, you'd still, because it's in our history that we have rights as Catholics to a Catholic education. It was part of getting Quebec in on Confederation, was to give minority religious school rights, right?
Wow.
And people say, well, your rights would be met in this other way. And so part of the push is like, actually, no, it wouldn't. Actually, if the whole framing of education is secular, and then you tack on a religion class, what you're actually saying is religion is an interesting option that some people are into, and we're okay with that if they keep it to themselves, which doesn't actually give religious minorities the right to have their children educated in their own religious tradition. It actually severely undermines your ability to communicate your faith to your children, because the whole structure says yeah, this is a neat optional extra for people of a certain sort of bent, maybe that's ethnic, maybe that's personality, but it has nothing to do with what's true. And this is the concern that religious minorities have, is they think certain things are true and they want to communicate to that to their children. Of course, the secular wing thinks certain things are true too, like that religion maybe isn't that important and should be kept private. That's a truth claim that's being reinforced in the way religion is treated in public schools. But they'll pretend that that's not what they're doing. So my book is like two halves. The first half is like this theoretical sort of exploration of like, there's no neutral here, guys. You're going to teach something from some point of view, and everyone's got their commitments, and let's not pretend that religious people are sort of and religious schools are the only ones doing this. And in fact, that's not brainwashing. But pretending that you don't have a point of view, pretending that you're neutral, is actually much closer to brainwashing than saying, hey, here's our perspective, and we're going to teach from that, and being honest about it. Then the second half of the book is really an exploration of one subject after another. So if in theory we can teach math from a Catholic point of view, what does that look like? What are the Catholic presuppositions of math? What are Catholic applications? And I talk about, I say content and context. So some things have more content, right? Like literature and the arts, you're going to have more Catholic content. But even something like math, where there's not a lot of Catholic content, I mean, maybe you can talk about some famous Catholic mathematician or something. Sure. But whether or not you've got a lot of content, you've always got a context. Mm-hmm. And so that's the second half of the book, is walking through Catholic content and Catholic context in health, phys ed, social studies, history, math, science, literature, and the arts.
Wow. I feel like I was so when I went to Calvin College, one class that everyone had to take, I actually managed a way to get around it, but was CPOL, which was Christian Perspectives on Learning, which basically is the entire speech you gave right there, Brett, because the entire Christian Reformed day school, there's an organization that has, at least, I don't know their current status, Christian Schools International, that this has been their perspective. It's connected with Abram Kuyper, who was this Dutch polymath who both founded the Free University of Amsterdam, led a split off the state church, and became Prime Minister of the Netherlands, founding the pillarization movement, which basically afforded different lanes, as we'd say in our modern parlance, with respect to this. But the idea behind that was exactly what you laid out, a certain degree of presuppositionalism that all subjects must be taught. There is no neutral space. You just basically laid out the whole thing. I'm just blown away.
Well, this is why people keep telling me I need to learn more from the Reformed. So it seems we've got some common ground here, but I've done a little looking. I haven't found like the book on the Reformed Christian day schools that would lay that out, but that might be an interesting.
I'll look around for you.
You mean like the way that like Saint Ignatius handles the Studiorum Ratiorum from the Jesuit perspective, Brett? Where he has
something like that would be
comprehensive.
Handy, right?
Yeah.
Here's like the blueprint for how we do this. Yeah. Because I mean, I'm leaning on like Catholic tradition, but I'm also operating in a context that the Ratio Studiorum wasn't written in, right? I mean, sort of the bigger question in the background culturally is sort of religious pluralism and its relationship with the state and secularity, and who gets to say what's what. I mean, the irony, well, I don't know if it's irony, maybe it's a little ironic, is like, Catholics are always very worried, and Christians in general, post-modernity, so, and basically I'm making a postmodern argument, right? I mean, I'm saying like,
that's why I wanted to jump in on that. Because it's, I have sort of two questions. What was the sort of the standpoint assumptions of, the really the building out of the U.S. Catholic Church primarily from the big city standpoint, it sort of spreads out. What was the original sort of thinking about thinking with those schools in terms of curriculum, et cetera? And then secondly, if Paul, is a product of Christian Reformed day schools and that whole sort of culture, why are we here? Right. And Paul, you have said on a couple of occasions that something stopped working. And so the question that I think I have is, what stopped working? What changed? Because it sounded like it was a pretty solid and well thought out model. So what changed?
I don't know. You go first, Brett. I got to think about that question because it's a hard question.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a really solid answer, but it's a question.
Yeah, and it's not a trick question. I'm thinking through this.
No, I think it's a good question. Okay, so I mean, this might be completely wrong, but here's where my mind goes. Right, I've met a handful of people who are now like in their 80s and 90s. I've given parish talks on a few things where a few people in their 80s and 90s asked questions that were clearly the product of a really integral, holistic, well thought through Catholic education. And I've been like stopped in my tracks because I'm used to speaking at a certain level. And there was a woman in a small town in Saskatchewan who asked a question that showed a knowledge of like Christian history and like the history of a certain question in moral theology. Wow. And she had like learned it in grade 8. And like, I know college grads who'd never heard of it. I can't even remember specifically what it was right now, but I just remember being sort of stopped in my tracks. And so, I mean, there was something pretty solid in at least some places. I wonder if part of what happened is in those times and places, there was a cohesive Catholic subculture that was quite distinct from the broader culture. And so the question of permeation was never explicit. It just sort of happened.
Yeah, right. And this is something that you talk about a good deal, Paul, that there's this sort of the surrounding ambient culture is such that it was thick, and that what strikes me again, I was listening to hours and hours of you talk about all a variety of things, Paul, is how that it was an intentional creation. Like the point of it all was a sort of a differentiation, right? That if I, as a sort of a cradle Catholic, look at the sort of the history of the United States and the history of education in the United States. I mean, the default assumptions of the U.S. educational system, the loose confederation that it always has been, is sort of a kind of a default mainlineism, right? And so that U.S. public schools were essentially free mainline schools in some kind of nice, and I'm using that word on purpose, some sort of nice way, kind of rubbed off edges and kind of cleaned up. But Catholics coming in and establishing these in certain cities very elaborate and very extensive parish school systems, those were always intentional, and there was always the sort of the heavy, the hard squeeze by the pastor to make sure that Bill and Sally sent their 5-6 kids to the parish school. And in fact, it was affordable, and there's another, labor is an issue. We could talk about that later on. It was affordable, but it was like, you're going to do this. If you're going to be a member in good standing, then you're going to send your kids to our school. And so Paul, it sounds to me that the Christian Reformed tradition has a similar sort of, the pastor has a heavy exertion of influence on the families, right?
Oh, yes. And again, this has broken down.
Yeah,
but
right.
Not
same.
But in places in the denomination still, usually in rural places, but in many places, you wouldn't really be a member of the Christian Reformed Church in good standing if you were sending your child to public school. You would be called before the consistory, and you would have to give a really good reason. And in fact, what was happening in the churches was that the churches basically, put their money together. I mean, it was affording the church itself was a relatively small thing.
Yeah.
Affording the K through 12. And in fact, over time, a lot of pastors became rather resentful because the church was sort of living on a shoestring. And
Yeah, the school was
as
sucking up all the
expectations
money.
rose, you had gymnasiums, you had football fields. I mean, you had everything for these Christian schools.
Mhm.
And that was really the community effort. And one of the differences between the Christian Reformed Church and the Reformed Church of America is Reformed Church of America sent their kids to public schools. If you are a member of the Christian Reformed Church, no, you were part of this group.
Yeah.
And you were catechized, not just in terms of the Bible class that you had, but in terms of all of your classes. That was the point of the entire educational system. And in fact, even Calvin College was first founded to prepare ministers and then teachers for the Christian education movement. And even when in my youth, I mentioned before, in place like Whitensville, Massachusetts, for my cousins, the great fear was that they would marry Catholic girls.
Sure.
So the great hope was the Christian school, because there would be these Calvin College graduates, single women coming into the community. And in fact, one of my cousins married one of them. The first day of, my aunts are looking around of their prospective daughters-in-law. I mean, it was that deeply tied to the community, but that has.
So I have a question about that. Yeah, I have a question about that. The word for that is endogamy, right? Is that the right word for to marry within a faith tradition?
I don't know.
I feel like I should.
It sounds right. Etymologically, that sounds plausible.
Yeah. So, okay. Well, anyway, I'll use the word. Sorry, everybody. I think that's the right word. That, of course, has broken down, hasn't it, Paul?
Yep.
I mean, the idea that, for most people, that, your primary concern would be whether or not your child marries someone in the faith tradition. That's almost entirely broken down, except for weirdos like me, right? Who, like, I think about this all the time for my own children, because I want my kids not only to take up the faith, but I know in my own experience that is a source of, not my personal experience. My wife is a devout Catholic and is all in with me, but I know from personal experience that is oftentimes a friction point through which the kids kind of fall down or away, or however you want to characterize that. So interesting that Calvin College sort of served that kind of endogamic function or something.
Yeah.
And it seems to me that we're circling around a few related issues related to pluralism, right? So if both in the Catholic context and the Reformed context, this was maintained through a pretty tightly boundaried subculture, then my first instinct is, well, where did it go wrong? It's that it wasn't equipped to deal with moving beyond the subculture. And so I suspect that what happens in Catholic schools is as they open out to the broader culture, they're unwittingly ideologically colonized by the secular, right? And so most of our Catholic schools, or for a long time, it wouldn't have even occurred to them that they weren't teaching math from a Catholic point of view. They just say, well, you can't, like, math is just math. So, and I think this movement towards curriculum permeation is kind of trying to make explicit something that might have been obvious, a few generations ago, but in a pluralist context, we actually need to explicitly say, no, there's not a neutral. Anyone pretending to be neutral is actually making a power move and trying to neutralize you. And so we kind of have to push back against that sort of overwhelming narrative that makes religious claims and religious worldviews automatically suspect and sort of outside the norm by claiming some bogus neutral in the middle. And I don't know for sure, but my gut tells me that, to go back to the original question at the start of this, like, what went wrong? I think we weren't ready for pluralism, and we've been blindsided, and now we're just sort of waking up and trying to claw our way back into the game.
Well, and also what is included in pluralism, right? I mean, Paul, you've been talking a lot about this, and again, in our church, Brett, we've just had some interesting things come out from the CDF the last few days that has caused all kinds of ripples throughout the Twitterverse. And Paul, I know that your tradition is anticipating a big report on a matter sexual, and so how does that fit into this sort of pluralistic narrative? Because it's one thing to talk about pluralism between Catholics and Baptists and whatever, evangelicals and Jews and Muslims. It's another thing when you're taking it out of something that at least has been traditionally considered not a religion into something that is increasingly taking on the clothing and the affect of a religion.
I've been thinking about these issues quite a bit lately, and it seems human beings need they need something to be activistic about. And for the Christian Reformed Church, historically, they were activistic about their particular Christian Reformed identity. I mean, to marry someone of the Reformed Church of America, that was a mixed marriage.
Got it.
And so we joked about it. And so the flag of being Christian Reformed was, and within that, there was a whole package of things. And I think I think in the counterculture, there was sort of a pushback on all such particularity, all such sectarian things. And there are a variety of other competitors. One of the things that I've been talking about a lot in my videos is sort of this default Christian nationalism. Evangelicals are, setting their hair on fire over Christian nationalism. And it's
really remarkable, honestly, as a sort of sideline watcher, because I have a lot of obviously friends, I'm amazed at the hand wringing and the it's really it really seems to be obsessive at the moment.
Yeah. And you read any history of American culture, and it's like, that has been the default position in terms of Protestants, which Roman Catholics, of course, know, because you were excluded from it until quite recently. And so now suddenly dread Christian nationalism is what we're to set our hair on fire. And it's like, have you read any history? But you had all of these little segmented groups that could sort of stay to themselves. And their rallying cry was for the Christian Reformed Church, to be distinctly Reformed and all of these things. And in the counterculture, that all got sort of watered down. And so today we sort of have, well, what ought we all to be activistic about? It's sort of this progressive liberationism. It might be, it might be anti-racism ought to be the one thing we're about. So now suddenly, let's say the Christian Reformed Church is anti-racism is the main thing. And it's not. Evangelicalism was always sort of this weird, broad, get souls into heaven by a personal relationship with Jesus Christ. Christian Reformity had its own particular flavor on that, but eventually was sort of widened into evangelical or mainlinism. And so, like I've said, with Rod Dreher's Benedict option, when I look at this idea, it's like, I don't know, we sort of practiced it until the 1960s, and then the walls came down, and we're not really talking about it.
Why? Like, what's the snag? Like, what is the thing? There's I don't know if you've ever seen this movie called Cold Comfort Farm. It's actually based on a novel, and it's kind of a riff on English novels, like stock characters in English novels. But there's a recurring theme that this character keeps saying, I saw something nasty in the woodshed. And it's like this traumatic event that you don't talk about. You say that you saw the thing, but you never actually talk about the thing. So what is it about this moment in church history, American and church history, that we saw something nasty and we're never going to go there again?
A lot of people point to the Second World War, which sort of drafted people from across the country into this war effort. A lot of, we had a whole generation of leadership in the Christian Reformed Church who had been through the war. And I think what a lot of people realized is that sort of our little huddle around Dutch Calvinist Christian Reformity we weren't that different from all of these other people, and we sort of look silly with our provincialism and our clannishness. So let's give that up. And then, especially in the civil rights movement, they're like, oh, here's this new existential, and yeah, correctly so. Jim Crow treatment
Yeah.
of African Americans is horrendous, and so we can all sort of get on with that. And then women, we can all get on with that. And so these broader national agendas sort of swamp and continue to preoccupy. And anyone who still sort of clanishly holds to their Christian Reformed provincialism, you know.
See, this is so interesting because I think a corollary was happening with the Catholic world, because remember, the Catholic world was also a ghetto. I mean, it was really, the most that you would see a Catholic mix with somebody else is if you were Irish and you lived next door to the Italian family. Like, and that was, and so it's funny, you go to Chicago and like you've got all of these, the next door, the neighbor, the Irish neighbor girl marries the next door neighbor Italian boy, and you have these mixed marriages, and it's kind of a Catholic joke. But so you think about just the phenomena of, you live in these very ghettoized worlds. Like, I live in this neighborhood in Chicago, right? I live on this block and this right next to St. Raphael's, and we don't like those, we play CYO ball against, St. John's, but that's about it. Like, and so you have these blocks, you have these schools, and then all of a sudden this huge war effort takes everybody out of all of their various tribes. And the US military has this radically homogenizing effect. And not only, of course, does that happen with Jews and, with Catholics and Jews, it's Catholics and Protestants, Protestant and Jews. Like, there's this incredible mix that occurs there. How do you come back from that, right? How do you go back to your enclaves after you've been in a foxhole? Jimmy Murphy has been in a foxhole with Saul.
Yep.
It just doesn't have, you can't go back. You won't go back.
And these were the leaders of the church for the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And they
so it
came back
galvanizes
from the war and led the church.
Right. And what galvanizes them, at least amongst the Catholics, and I think this was the way that Catholics have always, from what I'm understand, from what I've read and what I've talked to in terms of generations above me, is that Catholics have always been really, really anxious about fitting in to America, right? And they were not because they didn't eat fish on Friday. There were all these sort of these distinctives that they had held on to. But they really, really wanted to get on. But one thing that they were, that they were sort of in common with the sort of the WASP establishment is they were very anti-communist. Right. I'm talking about the American Catholic Church, was very anti-communist. Right. And so that becomes this thing that carries you all the way through, so that, you no longer have to worry about the distinctiveness of your various faith claims and faith traditions and priors, but we're all sort of American working against, the evil empire.
Yeah. Well, and then you've got the World War II, you've got the Cold War, which sort of, the Christian Reformed Church, generally speaking, quite politically conservative.
Yeah.
And then you hit the counterculture, and so you have sort of this new amalgam, which is sort of nationalistic. And then the counterculture, you have a deep anxiety about American exceptionalism. Richard Nixon lied to us.
Right.
The Vietnam War was not a war against communism.
Yeah.
We got embroiled in a civil war, which we probably never should have belonged in. And then, at the end of the Cold War, the wall goes down, and now now it's anti-Islam.
Yeah,
Okay.
Right.
And just the narrative keeps unfolding, and all of these people who had escaped the ghetto, the Dutch ghetto and the Catholic ghettos of various ethnicities, now suddenly, wait a minute, all of this stuff that we had in terms of our religious matrix, that's all sort of getting mapped onto these bigger movements. And now suddenly evangelicals and Roman Catholics, via Roe v. Wade, maybe a little later for the evangelicals, suddenly find themselves shoulder to shoulder with the Catholics, who, and again, I've been reading a biography of Jonathan Edwards. Jonathan Edwards was trying to evangelize the Indians, and the worst thing that could happen is that the French Canadians, get to them first and make them Catholics, because then they're going with the Antichrist. They're going,
and so they're really going to hell, right?
Oh, that's right.
No, absolutely. No, I think that's right. That's right. And it's baked in, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so getting back to
Brett wants to get on the.
yeah, sorry, go back.
Yeah, well, I just wanted to say, I mean, it seems part of what happens in things like wars is we rewrite the stories we tell ourselves about who we
about
are,
ourselves. Yeah, exactly.
right?
It's a new narrative.
And so the old narratives that grounded my identity, maybe in my Irish Catholic heritage or whatever it happened to be, maybe my Dutch Calvinist heritage, now is rewritten so that that's a very secondary element of my identity. And my primary element is as an American who, won this great war and now we're against communism. And like these stories become the primary lenses and they relativize the religious lenses. And so pluralism is a funny thing because, okay, we become more pluralist in a certain sense, but it's not actually consistent because other things that become the dominant narrative don't really admit of pluralism, right? You can be plural about all these secondary and tertiary questions all you like, as long as you're with us on this primary question. And if I get to, but I'm going to hope you don't actually even notice that the primary question is there. I'm hoping you think it's completely neutral, and so that there is true pluralism at the secondary and tertiary level, and we just ignore, we become blind to the fact that we have these other commitments that are in fact commitments instead of just the way things are, right? And I think all of our religious communities, I think we're figuring this out now, but for a long time, we just didn't actually see that we were playing the game with rules that were set from outside. And I think there can be a healthy pluralism that a Catholic can participate in. But I think when we tried to do that, we kind of got the wool pulled over our eyes because it wasn't actually a healthy pluralism. It was one that says, that's nice that you believe that nice little thing if you keep it to yourself over here and keep quiet about it. And so whether it's about math or it's about morality, we still have this same sort of thing, right? Like, well, there's a neutral morality that we all agree on. And if you have some funny additional Catholic morality that you want to tack onto that, well, that's your business, but keep it
to yourself.
Keep it to yourself. So if you want to do something, publicly scandalous according to your own community's standards, well, the community has no right to really enforce that in any kind of public way because that's your public life, and so that leads to, I think it's these presuppositions in the background, this pluralism that isn't really pluralism, that leads to these kinds of inconsistencies, that show up in various questions that we might discuss.
So, right, in keeping with that, are we asking our schools to do too much, right? Like, in other words, schools have been, I think, maybe the remaining institution, that has sort of, church, like let's just take like a local Catholic high school. It's got 1,500 kids and it's a robust enrollment, and that whole sort of thing, right? It's got a prominent football team, and all that. Everybody wants to go to the school, so there's a wait list, and the whole thing, right? It's established itself as a sort of a pillar of the city in which it exists in, and that school has found a way to weather all the stuff. It has weathered, the ebb of church attendance. It has survived church attendance. It has survived racist frames of seeing the world. I mean, it just survived so much, right? And so
the sex abuse crisis, vocational decline, right?
It because it has this, it's its own thing. So everything else has essentially died, right? Or has really lost its influence and its hold, but the school remains. And so why is I guess the first question, why has the school been able to survive, and is that a good thing or a bad thing? Like, I don't know.
Well, part of what's going on, so the Christian Reformed Church established this whole network of Christian day schools at tremendous sacrifice to the communities to establish them.
Yeah.
And what happened as the walls came down is that fewer and fewer, more and more Christian Reformed people are sort of, now you've got permission to send your kids to public school or the homeschooling, because the Christian Reformed
Yeah.
Church is sort of in the, are we going to gravitate to the main line or to the evangelical? And the CRC is always in that tension. So what
Interesting.
happened with even as, and then Christian Reformed churches are in decline pretty dramatically over the last 20, 30 years.
Oh yeah,
So
has that been a gradual decline and then a
it's
fall like
been a,
that, or has it just been a gradual?
in the 1980s, my father came home from a home missions meeting. They were going to set a numerical goal, this all church plant stuff,
Yeah,
church
yeah.
growth stuff, of 400,000 by 2000 for the denomination.
Mhm.
And right now, with probably a split coming over same-sex marriage,
Right.
I wouldn't be surprised to see the CRC get into the 150, 125.
Okay.
I mean,
Okay.
it's been 40 years the CRC's been dropping like a
Got it.
rock, especially in urban areas. Okay.
Mhm.
But now here's for the most part, because of this Kuyperian philosophy, Christian day schools are run by the parents, not by the clergy, because we have this sphere sovereignty ideas in our
Interesting.
theology.
Wow.
So parent organizations run the day school, not pastors. Pastors are in some ways outside. Okay.
Interesting. Wow.
And so what happens when the Christian Reformed churches are in decline, those were the feeders that pay the tuition to keep the school going. Well, the schools start looking around, where else can we get students?
Mhm.
And they're getting them from other evangelicals
Mhm.
who are homeschooling didn't work for them, but serious
Sure.
evangelicals. But the second group has been, I think this is true of the Catholic schools, has been people who are dissatisfied with
Yeah.
public education.
Right.
And so I mentioned to you guys, if you look at Eastern Christian School Association on Wikipedia, I looked at that a few years ago, and notable alumni of my high school, of my school system, Peter Kreeft, who was in the Reformed Church of America after Calvin College, disappointed Calvin College greatly by going to the Roman Catholic Church. And then a whole bunch of names, including the Jonas Brothers, who are all entertainers, young entertainers. And I had it where I met someone who is a relation of somebody I met here in Sacramento, completely apart from church schools, that said, oh, my nieces go to Eastern Christian. I'm like, what? Yeah, well, they didn't want them to go to public school. And for a lot of these other conflicts that we see happening in Roman Catholic schools, such as this woman who is, doing some online pornography, but she's very upset because when that got out, the local Catholic school showed her the door. And this, major op-ed piece in the Sacramento Bee over this hit other national things. And so, whereas before the Christian school was a function of the insular, specifically Dutch Reformed community, now in a consumer culture, it affords better than public school education, a little safer context. My wife is a public school teacher. Public schools have a duty to educate everyone. A private school can look at a family and say, you're not our kind.
Yeah, and that's what I mean. Like, what do we think schools are for, right? I mean, there's been a sort of a change in terms of its appreciation as a commodity, right? As opposed to something that's serving formation, right? And I think that's a big difference. That story really struck me. The Sacramento story, because they were indignant. The husband and wife who have run this very, very lucrative OnlyFans site, they were indignant that like, well, what does this have to do with our kids? Which was pretty amazing. And of course, me, the conservative crank, wants to say, oh, I don't know, everything. I mean, and yet, but they were outraged, right? It seems to me in the story, they were outraged that the principal had the audacity to have a problem with it.
Well,
I mean, how dare you, sir? Like, that was the sort of the thing. How dare you have a problem with my OnlyFans site?
I had a woman in my church. Before she married a young man from my church, she had been teaching in a Roman Catholic school in the Bay Area. And, just a couple of years ago, there was a rather dramatic thing that hit the paper where the Roman Catholic Church school in the Bay Area was daring to teach Roman Catholic perspective on human sexuality.
Yeah,
and it's the parents sending their kids to the school that were outraged. How dare you teach this to our children? And of course, from a religious perspective, it's like, why did you pick this school if you didn't? And now you're outraged that this particular religious community would like to actually teach their beliefs. And I mean, this is going to hit, you know, Calvin College just recently had another flare up with respect to same-sex, you know, LGBT questions.
Yeah, well, what happened? Tell us that story, because I don't think everybody in the audience knows the story.
Well, somebody, you know, some students set up a table, kind of like a
Steven Crowder table.
Yeah. LGBTQ is sin, you know, change my mind.
Yeah.
And so then some of the professors, you know, put on a t-shirt that basically said, we love our LGBT students. And given the position of the Christian Reformed Church, that's completely understandable. But in terms of how this gets then promoted out to the public conversation, you know, okay, well, should, you know, a generation ago, Bob Jones was basically said, you can't participate in the federal student aid unless you segregate your school. And this is, of course, the question, is that same going to be used?
If you desegregate the school,
is the same going to be used unless, you know, Christian educations, especially schools? There's a fair amount of buffers with respect to churches. But again, back to your comment, Brett, schools are seen as sort of public institutions. And so for let's say for Calvin College, that because it's the one university that's owned by the Christian Reformed Church, it's sort of the exception. They can't really deviate from the Christian Reformed Church's position on same-sex issues. So
how is that going to play out? Honestly, I mean, again, as a you know, look, Brett and I can riff for days on the amount of Catholic colleges that position themselves in a sort of heterodox position as regards the Vatican in terms of Catholicity, right? I mean, you know, we could rattle them all off essentially, right? You know, that every college, it's easier to count the colleges that would align themselves with the magisterium of the church than it is to count all the ones that don't.
Wow.
I mean, it's not even close.
Wow. Well, in the Christian, so Calvin College professors have to sign they used to be called the form of subscription. It's a covenant that basically says they are in alignment with the doctrinal positions of the Christian Reformed Church.
Yeah.
And the document that will come before Synod when we get to have it after COVID basically asserts that this posture on same-sex relationships is a confessional issue. That is a traditional perspective on marriage.
Mm-hmm.
That's going to we don't know, that could put some faculty at Calvin College who have more of a progressive view of same-sex marriage in a hot seat confessionally. So
what happens to them?
Well, that's a really good question. And that's why this, you know, this issue in the Christian Reformed Church really has the potential to just rip the denomination apart, as it has in many other denominations, because it's getting to the point now of you're going to have to, it has been sort of something under the radar in the denomination until, of course, one prominent Grand Rapids church ordains a deacon in a same-sex relationship, but we haven't had synod. And now this other document comes, which is a conservative document, but we haven't had synod. I mean, basically, if synod says this is the position of the church, love it or leave it, it's going to be very interesting.
So you predict that then you'll have people who will then leave it because they don't love it.
Well, yeah, the question is going to be, because of course the conservatives are going to go and say, unless you discipline Neeland Avenue, what if classist, so a church is within a classis? Well, what if the classis decides? We had a situation like this in Toronto a few years ago, where a church sort of asked the question, synod told the classis, take care of this, and classis said, okay, we will, and so it was resolved. But classis Grand Rapids East is the central classis, Calvin College is there. All of the Christian Reform institutions are there. If Classis Grand Rapids East won't discipline Nealon Avenue, this basically.
It's your Vatican.
No, that's exactly right.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, yeah, that's I was thinking the same thing, Brett.
So so our sister denomination, the Reformed Church of America, who's never done Christian day schools, they are right now basically in the process of splitting up. And they're splitting up between East Coast mainliners who have always been East Coast mainliners, and sort of Western big box evangelicals who have not had much of a Reformed accent, and then some Dutch immigrants who are probably closer to the CRC. So this is all happening in our field. And of course, Christian schools are right in the crosshairs because, there's talk of, well, file a lawsuit that Calvin College can no longer discriminate against LGBT students by not affirming their potential marriages or their relationships. So
right. So just out of curiosity though, at a place like Calvin College, do they at least on the books discipline let's say, Sally and Bill are juniors at Calvin College, right? And they're dating. Do they involve themselves in the sexual lives of Bill and Sally?
Not really. No.
What if they get caught?
No. This again gets back to your earlier question.
Is that
50 years ago, 70 years ago, a young couple that perhaps comes up pregnant out of wedlock would go before the congregation and confess their sin publicly to the congregation and then probably be married. But no, the Calvin College has tended to have a much more, we're not going to really get involved in terms of disciplining the students morally. Okay. But a lot of the chatter is, well, Calvin College is not affirming of same-sex marriage.
That word affirming is doing lots of work, isn't it?
It is doing a lot of work. And that is the line.
Yeah.
And whether or not anything, but this again goes all the way back to Brett's book in terms of, well, what is our source of sexual morality? And is this something that an institution, everybody sort of assumes a church can teach this. They might not like it, but churches have a lot of protection in the American constitutional system. Yeah. A school is sort of in the middle, and especially because of the Christian Reformed Church, schools are run by parents. A parental association could say, and so what's the relationship with the church? I don't know what that relationship are. All of your day schools and colleges technically owned by the church?
No. Right, because they have a variety of different types of schools, right? So they have schools that are owned and operated by religious orders, let's say like a Jesuit order or a Dominican order or the Benedictines or the Franciscans, right? All the various orders. So those schools are owned and operated by those respective religious orders that are incorporated, right? But all of those schools operate, Brett, you're the one who should answer this. All of those schools operate under the blessing of the local bishop, right? And so the bishop exercises the authority over which school can call itself Catholic.
And we call it. Yeah, go ahead.
But then there are also schools that are in fact owned by the diocese, right? They're secular institutions within the church, right? So it's a diocesan school,
right. Secular in the old medieval sense of secular, not in the contemporary sense. But so, and then add to this, in my context, we have publicly funded Catholic schools. So I mean, this question that you raised, the bishop gets to say which schools are Catholic. Yes, in theory, but we call that the nuclear option because
that's right.
I mean, that's the one sort of lever you have. But if you use it, you've used it once and it's blown up, right? If the bishop says this school can't call itself Catholic now, well, then it's over. It's outside of and if someone in Canada were to do that, then the legal questions that would follow from the legal right to Catholic schools if the bishop doesn't want them called Catholic. I mean, you'd be in some situation.
Well, and this is the kind of thing where like every like, rock rib conservative Catholic or trad Catholics like, yeah, why don't the bishop just tell those jokers over at, university, X and high school Y that they just need to get in line and do the thing. And it's like, yeah, it doesn't work that way. I mean, it does, but it doesn't, because you've effectively shot yourself. What is it? You saw off the branch that you're all sitting on.
Yeah, no, we talked in our last time about the kinds of decisions bishops have to make and how people imagine that there's really easy answers to some of them. And like, I mean, here's just one concrete question. Okay, let's say I'm a local bishop and I'm not super happy about the way, I don't know, teacher X is dealing with questions of homosexuality in the classroom, right? But I'm also in an arrangement where like literally thousands of kids who could never afford a Catholic education otherwise are receiving a Catholic education. So like, well, when someone's like, well, tell teacher X to smarten up or just shut the school down, a bishop can be, oh yes, but also these thousands of children who could never afford a Catholic education, what about them? To heck with them.
Yeah, right.
It's never like that. It's never that easy, but it's easy to be an armchair bishop.
Yeah, for sure. So, but then
I was wondering, you had asked earlier a question, Kale, that got me thinking about what schools are for, and I wonder if introducing this is important. So for Catholics, there's two competing things going on when you found a school. One reason you found a school is because you've got a Catholic population and you want to get your Catholic kids a Catholic education.
Right.
Probably you don't want to send them to the local Protestant or secular school, right?
Right.
But of course, that's not the only reason Catholics found schools. I mean, go to India or Japan, where far more people are educated in Catholic schools than the Catholic percentage of the population, which in either of those countries is minuscule. They educate far more of the population than they make up, right?
Right.
And so Catholicism has for at least 500 years, maybe longer, thought of education as an act of charity
and mission.
And mission.
Yeah.
And so when let's say you're in Canada, are your Catholic schools there because your Catholic kids have a right to a Catholic education, or because the Catholic Church has a right to do its mission? And I can say this now, but a couple months ago, I would have had to been much more careful because we had a court case in front of the Supreme Court hinging on just these questions. We won unanimously, but one of the misconceptions was that this was the only reason Catholic schools existed was to give Catholic kids a Catholic education. But historically, it's never been exclusively Catholic students. So the whole court case had actually emerged from the fact that there's a small town in Saskatchewan that lost its public school, reformulated as a Catholic school. All the non-Catholics in town didn't want to bus to the next town over, so sent their kids to the Catholic school anyways. The public school system sued the Catholic school system, saying, you're stealing all our students and you don't have a right to educate them. And so we actually lost at first at the provincial level, but then we won the appeal, and then it went to the Supreme Court and we won. But it would have had massive implications, and I would have been told, don't you talk about it on YouTube while the whole thing's going on, because it's a delicate thing. But what I think is important for us here is when you say, well, what's a school for? Yes, it's to provide Catholic education to Catholic kids, but it's also part of the mission of the church. And that necessarily implicates it in a pluralistic society where there's going to be people with different values, negotiating these things. And how do we figure out who gets to say what goes? And I think this imagined neutral is operating a lot when people are saying, oh, this Catholic Church shouldn't teach this or that or the other thing. Well, what should it teach? Well, it should teach something. Well, what is that? Well, the neutral secular morality that I don't recognize as even being even contextualized in any way. It just sort of floats about, right? So I think this is in the background of a lot of stuff, is this, we are trying to figure out how to be robustly Catholic or Reformed or whatever it is, Muslim, whatever your tradition is, in a pluralistic context. And a lot of our difficulties come from, like, there's two really bad ways to do it, right? One is to totally blend in with the world, and one is to
accommodationist,
right, accommodationist, and another is to sort of push back in a way that's really naive, and creates a lot of its own problems, right? And so I think even the recent blow up around Bishop Barron's push against the accommodationist on the one hand and the rad treads on the other is an expression of the same basic problem. We're trying to figure out how to live outside of our little enclave in a way that's robust and integral, but still, I don't even know the right word, but still open in a healthy sense, right?
Okay.
And
so
that underlies a lot of this.
So I want to jump in here. I think I agree basically with what you're talking about, and I think that we're struggling here. I guess my frustrations are that the all of the energy in the room, so to speak, all of the energy in our world here is not pluralism, actually, right? All of the energy in the room is toward a kind of, well, I guess what, like oppressive tolerance, right? The sort of the Gramscian notion that you should only tolerate that which you actually think is true, right? And so what's interesting to me, Wesley Yang, commentator, calls this the successor ideology, and the successor ideology to sort of this liberal pluralism that all of us have lived in and have tried to sort of operate in. You talk about this history, Paul, of World War II being this moment, right? And basically this is this moment of sort of the expansion of tribalism to be included into a sort of a broad liberal consensus, right? That's cute, because all of us are sitting ducks for something that is not interested in broad-minded tolerance, right? And yet they have co-opted the energy and the moral high ground of intolerance in the name of tolerance. Right. So like what's going on in Calvin College is a perfect example. And I don't want to pick on that, because look, I could pick 15 examples in which the Catholic Church lost years ago its universities. Right. So, I mean, more power to Calvin College that they've been able to, stave off this fight until 2021. But the successor ideology is not interested in accommodation. Right. This reminds me of the thing that Rod Dreher always talks about, that'll never happen. And but when it does, you bigots will have what you're claiming will never happen. But when it does, you bigots will have deserved it. Right. And that's where I think we are. We're all, I feel like we're just sitting ducks for the maw of this voracious neo-ideology.
So in Canada, we just expanded our access to assisted suicide. And of course, 4 years ago, when the law was struck down and all of us said, we need robust protections in here, or it's gonna, within a few years, we're gonna be killing the mentally ill, people suffering from mental illness. No, they would never lead to that. It's only in these cases like Lou Gehrig's disease and bone cancer, these extreme circumstances where people are already on their deathbed. And, of course, that's all we're going to do. And we say, well, your logic, your argument actually leads in a much more expansive direction. Well,
come on.
Yeah.
Don't
and then,
so reactionary.
it didn't take half a decade, right? I want to share a quote. So I just gave a talk to a group of Catholic teachers for Red Deer, Alberta. And they wanted me to speak about, Fratelli Tutti, so Pope Francis's latest encyclical. And I found a quote from it that I just found really speaks to the kind of situation you're talking about, like the sitting ducks.
Yeah.
So I'll share it. And I don't know, Paul, maybe if you can put it on the screen when you produce this or not, I don't, but it's from paragraph 13. It's actually a quote from another document he gave after a synod on youth. So he's talking about young people, which is particularly interesting for schools, right? He says, if someone tells young people to ignore their history, to reject the experience of their elders, to look down on the past, and to look forward to a future that he himself holds out, doesn't it then become easy to draw them along so that they only do what he tells them? He needs the young to be shallow, uprooted, and distrustful so that they can trust only in his promises and act according to his plan. I'm going to pause the quote for a second there. I think sometimes what happens in at least some educational contexts where critical thinking, what is called critical thinking is basically just deconstructionism, is precisely to make the young shallow, uprooted, and distrustful.
Right.
Okay, back into the quote. Well, let me do that last sentence again. He needs the young to be shallow, uprooted, and distrustful so that they can trust only in his promises and act according to his plans. That is how various ideologies operate. They destroy or deconstruct all differences so that they can reign unopposed. To do so, however, they need young people who have no use for history, who spurn the spiritual and human riches inherited from past generations and are ignorant of everything that came before them. And I just grab that, like when you say sitting ducks, I think that's exactly right. We've been sort of stripped of our identity and our heritage and we're told this, we're given this odd sense that like our identity or our heritage is somehow oppressive to the people around us. But of course, that's not applied in reverse. Other people's heritage and identity isn't supposed to be oppressive to us. I don't say that about my Muslim neighbor. So it's this, but the pluralism, the false neutral pluralist is just as happy, the way they accept Islam. I don't think they don't want to accept Islam on its own terms any more than they want to accept Catholicism on its own terms. They want to domesticate all of us.
I think part of the way the game is played now is this part of the reason education is such a battleground right now. And we see this with, there was a lawsuit around Sacramento. A kindergartner was transitioning, and you'll find this now in the lower grades. And so it was, here in the kindergarten class in public school, you should read this book about transitioning. And so there's a sense that, okay, here is the dominant public morality. If this is right and wrong, we have to raise our children in it. So then, of course, church schools, whether they be Reformed or fundamentalist or Baptist or Roman Catholic, they'll tend to resist this. And so you'll have conservative elements in the community that say, I don't want this being taught to my child. And if you have the financial resources, I'm going to send my child to the public school. But there's what happens, the way you sort of indoctrinate a broad population with either the truth or the lie is to usually break things down to fairly simple things. So for example, even this Stephen Crowder table at Calvin College, LGBTQ is sin. Now, any Christian Reformed minister going back to the 73 report and say, hey, wait a minute here. That is not the position of the Christian Reformed Church. There's a whole lot of nuance, but the way you mobilize a public,
of course,
is to break it down into very, things with handles on, so you can send your troops out to beat on the others. So, and so what we tend to have then is now we're going to have all of this segregation, and schools are going to bunker down. And part of me wonders if we're not just sort of heading back into new ghettos where we're going to have, except the ghettos are going to be rearranged, because it used to be the Roman Catholics. Well, now the Catholics and the conservatives of various other traditions, we're going to say, okay, we're going to not worry about some of the other touchy issues between Protestants and Catholics, because these bigger issues, which are more salient, are what unites us. And you just get a sense of, now we're going to start a new cycle. And of course, this in the United States gets played out massively in terms of the political parties.
But I still, the thing that I struggle with about, maybe it's motivational. Like I don't quite understand what the end game is for those who would like to ignore the tradition, right? And I'm using that, of course, in its most expansive and common way that we talk about tradition, even amongst our respective traditions, right? But I mean, I just don't know what the end game is, right? So you've got the troll group who sets up the Steven Crowder table, right? Obviously trying to get a rise, right? That is tailor-made for some sort of weird sliver of conservative Instagram world, right? And so then the professor gets up and says, I love my LGBTQ plus, students, right? Which on the surface of it, well, of course, we have to love our LGBTQ plus students, right? We're Christians, right? Okay, but we know that that's not the point either, right? It's actually not a winsome point that is being made, okay? So that's charade number one. But number two is like, okay, play this out. What do you want to have happen? What's the future of that? And that's where my mind just, I just get a blank fog. Like, what does that even look like?
I wonder if it hasn't really been thought through. I wonder if the thought process is that we've all been so co-opted by political ways of operating instead of appropriately reflective, philosophical, and theological reasoning, that we don't actually take the time to think about the implications of these kinds of questions. We need to figure out how we're going to position ourselves in our social and intellectual networks to be on the right or the wrong side of history, and engage at the level of political sort of sloganeering, right? So both the table and the T-shirt are forms of sloganeering, which are not designed to seek understanding. Right. It's
posturing.
It's posturing, right? Which is a political sort of approach to a question that is. Here's the thing: that we're not going to find good answers to this. Let's say the question in the background is, okay, Christianity needs to think about this cultural moment where people are expressing experiences in certain ways, in certain categories, and what does that mean for us? That's actually tricky work that the church does for 2,000 years, right? We engage with cultural ideas and human experience and whatever.
Yeah, right. This is the pastoral lane, right? That's the word that's going to be carted out, right? And
sure,
and the three of us are mature men. We understand what that means, but we also understand, right, Brett?
It means something different in the Roman Catholic Church than it does in the.
But not as much as you might think, Paul. I mean,
No, you're right. You're right.
But the idea here is and Pope Francis, to his credit, talks a lot about this idea of accompaniment and all that, but all of that actually does have limit.
So I would say the pastoral is part of it, but I would actually say another part is philosophical.
Okay, go ahead. Why?
I think we actually need to do the work to think about what this means. So for example, I think that if a significant number of people are rebelling against categories that the culture is used to think about gender,
of course, right.
maybe there are things in the way we've been deploying the categories that are worth thinking about. Right now, without presuming any answers, but what I want to distinguish is the pastoral, but also philosophical work on the one hand, that the question I think demands of us, if we want to be honest, and the desire on the flip side to turn it into a political football, to score points in what is large. It strikes me that what's happening when these table t-shirt things go on is that we're not actually having a serious conversation about this issue. This issue has become a proxy for every issue where the left and the right are against each other, where we need to demonize the opposition. And so here's one more chance to say that these people are unfaithful, or these people are hateful, or whichever category that you need to continue to further delegitimate the position of the opponent, because we're not actually interested, it seems to me, in these kind of things, in seeking understanding. We're interested in scoring points, because we've let every single issue, including one like this that impacts real people very seriously, become political footballs. And it frustrates me when, as Christians, we get sort of co-opted into the political battle, so we can't do either the pastoral or the philosophical work of really engaging the question, because before it's anything, it's about how the other people are wrong on this. And it becomes impossible actually to gain any deeper understanding.
Right. But I still think that we have to be honest about the frame. Right. And I'm not preaching at you, Brett. I know you know this, but I feel like I have to say it out loud here. It's like, it's not equal, actually. Talk about the table and the t-shirt. I love that. That's we should use the table and the t-shirt. It's like one's student, one's teacher, right? So right away, you've got interesting power dynamics going on there. One is anonymous-ish, one is not. And so that's part of it, and then motivation is another part of it. And so, and then we can also consult as, let's try to take it out of this sort of charged political situation. But okay, well, like, what do we really think about this stuff, right? I mean, from whence do we derive some sort of axiomatic points in which we can make an argument about the telos of human sexuality? Let me think. Where can I go for that? Well, and you see what I'm doing here. I mean, it's like I don't like the pretend game, right? I don't like the pretend game of the t-shirt side of the equation.
I've been preaching, we're in Lent now, and that a Christian Reformed minister is in Lent.
I love that, Paul. I love it, Paul. I love it.
Is a really amazing thing if you compare the Christian Reformed Church. In 1960, I don't think any Christian Reformed churches celebrated Lent. So we're in Lent, and I am. So on one hand, we've sort of got the problems of the bishop, where the bishop looks at this and says, we have to be pastoral. We have to be pastoral. We have to think about the big picture. We have to do all of these things. And that's exactly right. And so if you look at, say, the Calvin College administration, these are not stupid people. They made all the right noises. But again, to the revolutionary in the street, to bring up the 1960s culture, that's the kind of slow, that's the kind of slow tolerance to the status quo that the man uses to defer the revolution.
Right,
okay.
Right.
So then I love to look at Jesus, because what I see Jesus doing in the Gospels, and I've been in Luke, from Luke 9, all the way to the end of the book, is Jesus is riding these dynamics like a boss. Because on one side, you've got the mob.
And he's doing one of these, like,
right.
the whole time.
That's right. You've got the mob on one side that would love nothing better than for Jesus to say, if you don't follow me to Jerusalem, you're not going to have a country. And, let's storm Jerusalem and take him out. So he's got the mob that is just waiting to be incited. And of course, you've got those who are, the Romans and tax collectors and prostitutes and sinners. And you just watch Jesus weave through this, but Jesus isn't doing it like, in a sense, a bishop has to now, or a college president at Calvin College to, let's slow down, let's balance, let's think. Jesus is doing it in real time in the midst of the mob. And no, it's going to cost him his life.
I was to say, it doesn't end well initially.
But this I think is the kind of vision the church needs to have, in that it should not be surprising to Christians that you are going to find yourself on the bad side of the power differential
Yeah.
on a regular basis. If you're running a Christian college and you want to stay faithful to this particular perspective of human sexuality, you might lose your preferential treatment in terms of the United States program of tuition assistance. This is the big story. And so I think, to me, I would like to point to Jesus and say, well, this is probably the guy we should be paying a lot of attention to. Now, that doesn't necessarily answer the question of the t-shirt and the table in the moment, but that is where we should look to figure out, because at some point Jesus he's eating with Pharisees, and he's saying, oh, by the way, I noticed you didn't wash my feet. And he's not afraid to call them whitewashed tombs. And to the sinners, he's saying, oh yeah, they are sinners. And today, I mean, all of this, of course, has been wedded into history and through the counterculture. And so now, even when we read the parable of the prodigal son, we sort of cheer for the son as a revolutionary and say,
That's right.
well, hey, wait a minute here. These tax collectors were siding with the imperialists and the oppressors, and Jesus eating with prostitutes. They are sinners because they are collaborating with the enemy. Yeah. And, Jesus is soft on, the Jewish girl sex trade. These are all the varieties of issues, and they're all right there. And so I think this has to be part of the equation.
But even in that, right? He calls them us out of that, right? And I can't get over the fact that God, Jesus wants me. Jesus wants, I'm not, he wants something for me. And sometimes I don't want what Jesus wants for me. And, we've all lived lives here, and we know that tension in our own lives, where I want something and I know that Jesus wants something else for me, something more for me, and I fight him on that score, right? Yeah, that's great, Jesus. I don't want that right now. Thank you very much. I want this over here. And I don't, so Brett, you were talking about, sort of talking like, you don't, if you're merely sloganeering, you're not dealing with persons, right? And I worry about the that's why I brought up the pastoral, that the pastoral is supposed to call me out of myself, out of my sinfulness, out of my selfishness, out of my narrow appreciation of what my desire is today on Friday afternoon, right? I'm supposed to be called up and out to something more. And why have we seem as a church, broadly understood, to have lost our nerve when it comes to challenging each other. And Paul, this is going to be right up your alley, but this is why I think Jordan Peterson is so inspiring to people, because he goes right to that point and he says, no, in his way, right? And I would submit that there are certainly limitations to that. But he's saying, no, don't just give in to yourself.
Right.
That's an anti-gospel.
One of the things that I think, I'm going to sound like a broken record, but one of the things that I think really hampers our ability as Christians to call one another to account is the political framing we have. So the recent dust up over Bishop Barron's piece, where he got criticized hard from the left and from the right. But what did they say? The left-wing people were happy for him to critique the right, and the right-wing people were happy for him to critique the left.
That's right.
Right. And so it's like everything is already preset. If I criticize criticize isn't the right word. If I try to hold my brother or sister Christian to account on this or that topic, I can be dismissed as trying to impose some political category right off the hop. So because our categories are primarily shaped by the political culture, we have built-in excuses to not listen to one another when we try to hold one another to a higher standard. So I feel like we're really crippled by that. And your example, Paul, of how Jesus sort of weaved through that is amazing to me. I was thinking of the line, and this is the judgment, or depending on your translation, the verdict. And this is the judgment, that the light came into the world and people hid because their deeds were dark. Yeah. And it seems to me that what's happening with Jesus in his various encounters is when people encounter Jesus, they get shown for who they really are. And I have to learn that. Like when we do messaging out of a diocesan office, we know that we're going to get certain responses, right? So like, do you tell the truth straight? Or do you try to like anticipate this kind of feedback that you're going to get and try to mitigate it and play that game? And sometimes you say to yourself, wait a minute, it's okay if they say what they're going to say. We'll say the true thing and let them say what they're going to say, because actually when they say that, then the truth about their position will be known. And we don't have to worry about it. Like they're free to say that. Let's say the true thing and let the reaction be what it is, because that's the judgment. The judgment is, here it is. It's now out in the open. So we don't have to play that game. Now, I'm not using a specific example, and it can get really complicated, but I think just in general, trying to remember that Jesus's approach, he wasn't afraid of conflict if conflict would lead to clarity, right? I don't like conflict if it leads to lack of clarity, if it just muddies the waters and makes us all confused. But I'm a little bit conflict averse anyways, and I need to remind myself by looking at Jesus that conflict can be okay if it leads to clarity, right? And I just wish we were more committed to our own Christian presuppositions so that we would be able to critique one another well. The spiritual works of mercy, right? Like correcting, the ignorant. Like it's so hard to do because our own egos are in the way, in a way that Jesus didn't have that same problem. But also the categories to dismiss us as coming from this or that political thing, so I don't need to listen to you, it makes it really hard. And if we don't live in real community with real flesh and blood people, but we only live in virtual communities with ideological allies and opponents, that multiplies it by 10. It just gets so much worse.
But that's what I'm talking about. The energy in the room is precisely there, right? There is no community. Period. Full stop.
Yeah.
This is what Pajot called Peterson out on the other day, right, Paul? Yeah. It's like, you don't have a community. You've got fans, and stop before you talk, Jordan. That's not community. So, and Jordan's like, oh, okay, that's right. Yeah, it's true.
I have a friend who is deeply troubled by the breakdown in our local Catholic community. The kind of Facebook wars that happen. People who should be on the same side of things getting in dust-ups. And he's made it like a ministry almost to just phone people. Like as soon as he sees anything going off the rails on Facebook, he just phones you. Yeah. And he'll like go out for beers with people on either side and like help them to see and understand one another better, because the platform does not allow, or I shouldn't say it doesn't allow, but it certainly doesn't enhance, and it certainly mitigates our ability to have healthy conversations. And he's just like, no, I'm going to do something about it. I'm going to actually build real community. I'm making phone calls. I'm inviting people out for beer, so that these like differences, which if they happened over beers, they would be like interesting discussions.
Yeah, you'd move on and like, let me buy you around and we're done. Yeah.
Right. But if they happen on Facebook, they like shatter your community. Yeah. Or show that there was no community, or something like that.
Yeah, right.
And you're right in that. Again, what I'm really impressed with about what Jesus does so I've been reading a bunch of Ken Bailey is a New Testament scholar who wrote in the 70s during the Beirut Civil War.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. You've mentioned him before.
Yeah,
I've
and so
always wanted
Jesus
to
through
show
modern
that, yeah.
eyes comes from
That's
there.
right.
And so he's sort of looking at it from Middle Eastern context, but he's also looking at it through the lens of the Beirut Civil War in the 70s. And again, Jesus just manages to hit these things at all different levels. And so this Sunday he's going into Jericho, and actually Ken Bailey has a video on YouTube about this, which is tremendous. He's going into Jericho, and of course all of Jericho, the Jericho bigwigs would have come out to meet him, and they're all trying to hustle him into Jericho because they'll have a big banquet for him, and they'll celebrate the local rabbi celebrity coming through Jericho on his way to Jerusalem. And of course, there's a blind guy saying, "Oh, Jesus, Jesus." And Jesus, shut up. They need to deal with this homeless dude. And Jesus stops and has them bring him then. And then, of course, Jesus is passing through Jericho, and everybody is panicky because, oh no, he's not going to let us put him up overnight. And then who does Jesus spot but Zacchaeus in the tree and say, "Oh, change of plans. I will stay in Jericho for a meal. I'm going to your house, Zacchaeus."
Yeah.
And you just watch how not only is he shattering, because I think you're exactly right, Brett, that okay, it's LGBT, we have a variety of issues, but the political dynamics, the proxies of this conflict, you insert any other issue and the dynamics are the same. And Jesus has a way of saying, okay, we've got Romans versus Jews here. We've got tax collectors and centurions, and we've got zealots and Essenes. But then there's also like your friend on Facebook, there's also the political, and then there's the personal. And Jesus just has a way of cutting through all of that. And so, okay, I'm healing this blind man, and I'm going to Zacchaeus, I'm going to your house. And then he tells the parable of the mina. And so, again, I think as we navigate these waters, we should work very hard on paying attention. Of course, along the way, Jesus is teaching about a whole variety of issues, and I'm not discounting those, but I think we've paid too little attention to the political dynamics that are at play and understanding how this should give us guidance because the bishop has to also navigate those things, as does the local pastor, as does the president of the college. And the skill with which Jesus does this, I think, is part of the reason in Tom Holland's words, how are you able to make someone crucified as a slave intelligible and attractive, not only to your present generation in the first century, but every other generation that is going to come after across all of the other cultural spectrums. And in fact, and Tom Holland says this is an astounding literary feat. And then I add to this, it was done 4 times by 4 different authors in the same century. And the one thing all 4 had in common is this one man. And so for me, in terms of the church, in terms of all of these issues, we should be laser focused on Jesus and saying, how did he navigate these wars?
Can I say something about prayer? No
talk about prayer.
No talking about prayer. I mean, so here's the thing, right? Trying to follow Jesus is tricky in a lot of ways. Okay, that was a really general statement, but what I mean to say was, like, when you're God and sinless and perceive the human heart in a way that nobody else can, maybe you have some tools for walking through that that the rest of us don't have to the same degree, right? But here's I worry, right? Like, my ego is going to get in the way. The great problem with me challenging somebody who I disagree with is that instead of me making the truth clear, what I might be making clear is where my own ego is at and what my own problems are. And so, a lot of times we wonder, like, when we think about, well, you should pray before you have this conversation, or before you enter this situation, you should pray. Oh, well, why should you pray? Because God will give you strength. Okay, sure. but is it like some sort of magical, like you get this sort of grace infusion where you've got the superpower, or God will confound your enemies so that they won't know how to talk or something?
That's right.
But
it's humility, right? I mean, you're praying for Lord, grant me an insight into my heart, into their hearts, and this is, I mean, Paul, when you're working with, people in your congregation, I'm sure this is precisely the kind of dynamic that you have to sort through. It's not different than the dynamic if I've got a squabble between two students and I've got to be magnanimous enough, right? Great-souled enough, right? To hear, hear student A, hear student B, and to hear me, like, where's my bias? Where's I'm going? And I need to be able to kind of rise above all of that or pierce through it or something along those lines. And so again, I keep going back to this table and t-shirt business, right? What is the motivation? Like, what if, like, why does the troll student set up a Steven Crowder table and says, LGBTQ is sin? Is that what it said, Paul? Is it something like that? Right? What is he really doing? Right? No, that's an actual question.
Right.
I mean, we know that he's trolling, right? But why?
Right.
What is he doing?
My guess. Oh, yeah.
Okay,
so
no, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think one reason people who troll me, I think, I mean, here I am psychologizing the enemy, which is always dangerous. I think one reason people troll is because they're anxious. There's something wrong in the world, and I don't know what to do about it. And taking a pot shot at somebody on Facebook or setting up a table in a student commons or whatever is at least a way of doing something, because the world is going to hell in a handbasket and I have no agency. Right.
And
I need to do something, right?
Yeah, right. So it's this moment where it's like, I think something is true. I look around me and it feels like nobody else is willing or wants to say that something out there is not true. And the not truth being said out there is threatening something that I actually hold as sacred. Right. And I'm worried, right? I have genuine anxiety that I am going to somehow lose, right? And not in like some sort of silly game type way, but like to really not be affirmed, right? And I was just listening to something the other day, Paul, another Jordan Peterson podcast, and I think it was with Brett. It was the second one that he did with Brett, and I don't know if it was on his channel or it was on Brett. I think it was on his channel.
It was on his channel.
And he starts breaking down. Brett Weinstein. Sorry, Brett. He starts breaking down, and he says, Brett, you have no idea how starving people are for affirmation. I thought that was really a profound moment, and I had not quite seen the Jordan Peterson phenomena in those terms exactly, right? And so again, going back to the table,
and that should be for both sides.
I was just going to say, I'm gonna come to that, right? And so, okay, so then you've got the guy with the t-shirt, right? So do the same thing. What is he worried about? There are good reasons. There are real things that he's worried about, right? That this posturing in the commons with the Steven Crowder table is hurting a kid, another kid, a group of kids. I get that. I really do get that. But what is your role as the professor? Is your role to like throw off the gloves and jump into the WWE ring with the table guy? I don't think it is. I think
now you're with the bishop.
I think I think that's a failure of, you're not showing empathy to the troll, because we've been taught that the troll is bad, right? The troll hates gay kids, let's say. Maybe he doesn't hate the gay kids. Maybe actually he's worried that something that's even more important than the gay kid, right? In this, like the gospel, let's say. Like, who's going to stand up for the gospel? Like, I think that's important.
Or he might be gay himself, and he's been pushing this sucker down. I mean,
Well,
you see plenty of that.
Maybe so. Right. Maybe he's right. Maybe the troll is actually a kid who suffers from same-sex attraction, and he has made, a pinky swear with the Lord that I am going to abide by biblical teaching. I'm going to like suck it up. I'm going to do this. I'm going to be, a suffering servant. And I'm looking at people across the commons, and they're like, oh, don't worry about that suffering. You don't have to suffer. The only reason you're suffering is you haven't given in to what you really are. Just the layers of gospel and anti-gospel fighting with each other in this silly little, table t-shirt situation. I mean, it's something. I mean, it's something. And it's sad because it becomes immediately this 2D black white thing. And
yeah. And to Brett's point, it becomes political, and it becomes a zero-sum game, winning and losing. And it becomes everything in our culture all at once.
But Paul, it has deep, look, Calvin College could fall apart on this
Oh,
thing.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Calvin College could be dissolved in a matter of months because of this.
This is the wisdom this isn't the whole answer, but part of the answer is don't feed the trolls. I mean, right? Like wearing the t-shirt in response to the table might just be reinforcing
and posting it on Instagram.
Okay, sure, right? Right.
Saying,
so
just saying.
If what we really need is encounter with a person, well, then the troll is a person who needs an encounter, but the troll is tricky because the troll has set themselves up. They've asked for a certain kind of response that won't actually help their own situation, right? And so this is what Jesus does, right? Like when someone asks for a certain response that's not actually going to help, he doesn't give them that response, right? Like he won't play that game. And I think learning, and I've made this mistake on my own Facebook where I've been getting trolled, and I didn't realize until after I responded that, that was a troll, and I just gave the troll exactly what they're looking for. Therefore, I lose. Even when I'm right, I've lost, and that keeping at the forefront of our mind that the encounter with the person, whether it's the persecuted minority or the troll, or maybe they're the same person. For what, in all of myriad situations, if there's no encounter with a person, if it's only an encounter with an idea, or worse, with an ideology, there's nobody wins.
Yeah.
So how do you re-dimensionalize the world from a flattened 2D binary?
So one of the things that I was working through with my Lenten series, Jesus loses his culture war. Yeah. He goes up above Jerusalem and he weeps, and he says, I long to gather you, if only you would be gathered. And Jesus knows within a few decades, there's going to be the revolt in 67. Rome is going to come in. The menorah is going to be hauled through with the triumph of Titus. That is coming, and the Son of God can't stop it. So right there, you have to begin to say, what exactly is Jesus doing? And how is he working? And what is he willing to, and again, because I've made this point before, after if I were Jesus and popped up out of the grave on Easter Sunday, I'd stop by Pilate's house. I'd say, how do you like me now? Knock on Herod's door. Jesus doesn't do any of that. and so, and so then I think we in the church have to focus on him. And I don't think we're going to just read this now suddenly and, here's the answer. This is what we're going to do. No, it's not going to be that way. Right, and we're going to make lots of mistakes along the way. And that's always the way it is. But I think it is, the Gospels are deeply instructive for how to navigate this culture war. and not just in terms of what's the right side of the gay issue or the abortion issue, or not just the right sides of these moral issues, but in fact, how to engage each other in, I don't even know the words to say, but how to play this game in the midst of a culture war. And I think that's what Jesus is teaching us. And I think we have a lot to learn.
So, yeah. So
now you're the one with the time thing. I just want to make sure you know that, Kale.
yeah,
So.
I know. I got a couple
Yeah, because
minutes.
that was a nice tight package right there.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, you know what? That I like. I can't speak against that. I think that's the real deal right there.
So maybe that's where we'll end this for now.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm good with that.
Okay.
Sounds good.
So, all right. Well, I'm going to end the recording. We'll have a minute or two just to wrap up. And so thank you for watching.
Oh, it was great. Thank you, Paul.
Leave a comment. I know there'll be a few.
Good to be with you guys again.
Yeah.
All right.